The Sima clan did not burst onto the scene with the thunder of conquest, but with the quiet, deliberate footsteps of political maneuvering. Their story begins with Sima Yi, a man whose reputation for patience and calculation became almost legendary. He wasn't the kind of leader to gamble on bold strokes. Instead, he waited, observed, and struck only when the odds were firmly in his favor. Think of him as a chess master who never showed his hand until the final move, even while others believed the game was theirs to win. By the time Sima Yi passed away, his sons had inherited not only his positions, but also his shrewd sense of timing. Sima Shi, the elder, took control first. He was firm, commanding, and skilled at balancing military power with court influence. Yet his tenure was cut short, and it was his younger brother, Sima Zhao, who truly solidified the family's authority. Zhao had a knack for inspiring loyalty among generals while keeping the nobility in check. The man's ambition was so obvious that a popular saying arose: "Everyone knows Sima Zhao's heart." Everyone understood his designs, yet he never openly made the final leap. It was almost as if he was content to prepare the ground, letting his descendants reap the harvest. And that's exactly what happened. When Sima Zhao died, his son Sima Yan inherited not only his father's mantle, but also the expectation that he would finish what had been set in motion. Yan was young, confident, and less hesitant than his predecessors. He understood that legitimacy mattered just as much as raw power, so he framed his rise as destiny fulfilled rather than ambition satisfied. By 266, the old order gave way, and Yan, now known to history as Emperor Wu, stood as the founder of a new dynasty. It's worth pausing here to consider how remarkable this was. For decades, people had lived through war, shifting alliances, and fractured loyalties. Families longed for stability. Farmers wanted to plant without fear of armies trampling their fields. Scholars wanted a court that valued their words rather than silencing them. When Emperor Wu claimed the throne, many must have felt a cautious hope. Perhaps this new dynasty would bring back a sense of order, even if only temporarily. But power never comes without baggage. The Simas had risen through manipulation, intrigue, and military backing, not through a groundswell of popular affection. Their rule began with grandeur, lavish ceremonies, proclamations about heaven's favor, promises of peace, but under that glitter lay the reality of how power had been seized. It wasn't a revolution of ideals, it was a carefully orchestrated takeover by one family who had played the long game better than anyone else. Still, there was something intoxicating about that moment. After years of fragmentation, the possibility of unification loomed large. Emperor Wu had both the authority and the determination to chase it. And for the weary population, even the illusion of stability was better than the chaos they had endured. The rise of the Sima dynasty was a turning point, a moment where ambition, opportunity, and timing converged. And though it would later become clear that their house carried flaws as deep as any other in those early days, it felt like a fresh beginning. The lantern of legitimacy that had flickered for so long was suddenly burning bright again, held high by a new dynasty eager to prove its worth. Sima Yan's ascension wasn't marked by the clash of armies or the roar of a battlefield. It was marked by ceremony, ritual, and a quiet but undeniable transfer of destiny. He was young, poised, and had inherited the heavy mantle of his family's ambitions. Unlike his father, who had hesitated at the edge of absolute power, Yan stepped forward with certainty. He declared that heaven's favor had shifted to his house, that his lineage now carried the sacred duty to rule. And people believed him, or at least, they accepted him. After years of turbulence, the appearance of stability mattered more than dissecting the mechanics of how it had come about. When he took the throne as Emperor Wu, the moment was staged with layers of symbolism. Ancient rites were performed, seals were passed, and proclamations were read aloud to officials gathered in awe. To the common people, word traveled in whispers and proclamations nailed to city gates. There was a new son of heaven, and with him came the promise of peace. In a way, it felt less like the birth of something brand new and more like the fulfillment of an inevitability. Everyone had seen the Sima family tightening their grip for years. Now, the open acknowledgement brought relief as much as surprise. But Yen wasn't content with titles and ceremonies alone. He wanted more than legitimacy. He wanted to make his dynasty feel unshakable. He expanded the court, distributing positions generously among aristocratic families. This made him popular with the elite, but also planted the seeds of dependency. He gave stipends and lands to relatives and nobles, believing that by binding them with rewards, he would bind them with loyalty. For the moment, it worked. Loyalty and gratitude flooded in, creating an air of unity at court. Yet underneath, it also meant the state's resources were spread thin, its finances strained, and its reliance on family politics locked in. Still, Yen exuded confidence. He believed he was the one destined to reunite a fractured land. He wasn't just content with ruling part of the realm. He saw the dream of unity within reach. That confidence spilled over into how he conducted himself. His court shimmered with extravagance, filled with scholars, poets, and ritualists who praised his wisdom. At the same time, generals sharpened their swords for campaigns designed to extend his rule across every corner of China. What made him stand out was the sense that he wasn't merely another power-hungry noble, but someone who truly saw himself as heaven's chosen. He carried himself with the assurance of a man who believed he embodied fate itself. And for a while, people believed him too. Hope blossomed. Farmers thought of planting their fields without fear of marauders. Merchants envisioned roads free of blockades. Scholars dreamed of serving a stable empire that valued their words. Of course, the reality would be far more complicated. But in that moment of ascension, none of that mattered. What mattered was that a new emperor sat on the throne, carrying the mandate in his hands and promising a fresh era. It was the dawn of Jin, and with it came both the intoxicating dream of unity and the hidden shadows of challenges yet to come. For all the pomp of founding a dynasty, Sima Yan knew his throne wouldn't be secure as long as rival states lingered. The land had been fractured for decades, and while his family's power stretched across the north, the south still lay under the rule of Wu. That kingdom, nestled along the Yangtze River with its fertile lands and formidable natural defenses, was the last obstacle standing between Jin and the dream of complete unification. To leave it unconquered would be to rule an empire with a missing piece. And an empire missing pieces never feels whole. Wu had been resilient. Protected by the Great River and buoyed by generations of strong local leadership, it had weathered storms that had toppled others. Yet by the time Emperor Wu set his sights on it, Wu was no longer the powerhouse it once had been. Corruption crept through its court, military readiness lagged, and internal rivalries sapped its strength. Still, the challenge was significant. Rivers, marshlands, and fortified cities made southern campaigns notoriously difficult. Armies that tried to cross the Yangtze often ended up bogged down or beaten back. History was full of commanders who underestimated Wu's defenses and paid the price. Emperor Wu wasn't reckless. He prepared with care. He gathered supplies, secured loyalty among his generals, and mapped out the campaign with the precision of a man who knew failure would be unforgivable. This wasn't simply about adding territory, it was about proving that heaven truly favored his dynasty. If he unified the realm, he could silence doubters who whispered that his rise had been nothing more than clever politics. The campaign began with momentum. Jin forces pushed southward, crossing the waters with fleets and building momentum city by city. Wu's resistance was patchy, often hampered by divided command and wavering morale. Where once Wu armies had been fierce, now they fought with hesitation, as if even they sensed the inevitability of their fate. Surrender began to ripple across the south. Generals and officials defected, preferring to join the rising dynasty rather than cling to a kingdom in decline. The final act came in 280, when Jin forces stormed into the Wu capital. The last Wu ruler, Sun Hao, surrendered rather than prolong a hopeless fight. Imagine the moment. After nearly a century of division since the fall of Han, the land was once again under a single dynasty. From the north to the south, from the mountains to the rivers, banners of Jin fluttered in the wind. To ordinary people, weary of endless battles and shifting borders, it must have felt like waking from a nightmare. For the first time in generations, they could tell their children they lived in a united empire. In that moment, Emperor Wu's vision was realized. He had done what others before him had dreamed of but failed to accomplish. He brought the scattered realms together, not by chance, but by deliberate force and unshakable ambition. Songs were written praising the feat, officials hailed it as the restoration of order, and the people dared to hope that perhaps a new golden age was beginning. And yet, unification is a double-edged sword. To bring together so vast a realm meant also inheriting its fractures. The officials and nobles who now filled the court came from different regions, each with their own loyalties and rivalries. The costs of maintaining such a broad territory drained the treasury. The generals who had won the wars now expected rewards, power, and influence. On the surface, the empire was whole. Beneath the surface, new tensions were already brewing. But for now, the moment belonged to Emperor Wu and his dynasty. The banners of Wu had been lowered, and the dragon throne of Jin stood unchallenged. The land was won, and the people, though they could not yet see what storms lay ahead, breathed a sigh of relief. For a brief and dazzling moment, it seemed as if peace had finally returned. The years immediately following unification felt almost surreal, like waking up to a morning without thunder after a season of storms. For decades, people had known only war, the endless marching of armies, the smoke of burning villages, the chaos of shifting borders. Suddenly, the banners of one dynasty stretched across the land, and the drums of battle grew quiet. Farmers could return to their fields without fear of soldiers seizing their harvest. Merchants reopened trade routes that had been cut off by rival states. Families separated by borders finally reunited. There was a collective exhale, a fragile sigh of relief that maybe, just maybe, the age of swords was over. Emperor Wu basked in this moment. He imagined himself as the restorer of order, the one who had healed a fractured world. To prove it, he launched projects meant to symbolize stability, restoring palaces, rebuilding administrative offices, and commissioning great ceremonies that reminded people the empire was whole again. His court became a glittering hub, drawing in scholars, poets, and artists eager to lend their talents to this new age. Rituals were revived, Confucian ideals were praised, and an air of cultured refinement returned to the capital. It was as if the dynasty wanted to erase the memory of chaos and replace it with the vision of harmony. For a time, it worked. Grain shipments flowed steadily, revenues filled the treasury, and tribute arrived from regions now bound to the center. Records from the period speak of full granaries and bustling markets. Ordinary villagers might not have cared about the lofty rituals in the capital, but they cared deeply about peace. They could plant, harvest, and raise their children without fear. That alone made Emperor Wu's reign feel like a blessing. But peace has a curious way of breeding complacency. Emperor Wu, flush with success, grew indulgent. The court, once a place of stern deliberation, slipped into extravagance. Nobles wore silk embroidered with gold, banquets lasted for days, and lavish gifts circulated among the aristocracy. The emperor himself, who had once carried the aura of a strong founder, became increasingly distracted by pleasures. He granted land, titles, and wealth with reckless generosity, often to members of his extended family or favored courtiers. On the surface, it looked like prosperity. Beneath, it was hollowing out the state. The system he built leaned heavily on aristocratic clans. By showering them with privileges, he ensured their loyalty in the short term, but he also created a ruling class bloated with wealth and entitlement. These families wielded more and more influence, while the authority of the central government slowly diluted. It was a dangerous trade, stability bought at the cost of long-term vulnerability. In hindsight, it feels almost inevitable that these aristocrats would later undermine the throne they owed everything to. Yet in those first years, optimism overshadowed concern. Poets compared the emperor's reign to springtime after winter. Officials praised his benevolence. Even when signs of strain appeared, the rising costs of supporting so many aristocrats, the quiet grumbling of overtaxed farmers, they were brushed aside. Who wanted to spoil the illusion of harmony after so much bloodshed? The dream of peace was intoxicating. It lulled the empire into a sense of permanence, as if unity itself could ward off future troubles. But peace, no matter how golden, always carries the risk of forgetfulness. People forgot how fragile it was, how quickly fortune can turn. And while the court reveled in luxury, while officials celebrated stability, the seeds of future discord were already being sown quietly in the background. For the moment, though, the dream felt real. The Jin Dynasty stood proud, its emperor confident, its people hopeful. The fields yielded crops, the markets hummed with trade, and the roads filled with travelers who no longer feared ambush or blockade. It was a brief, glittering chapter, a promise that the past century of division had finally ended. And yet, like all dreams, it would not last forever. The glitter of peace has a way of masking rot, and in the Jin court that rot spread quietly through the halls of privilege. Emperor Wu, generous almost to a fault, believed that rewarding those around him would keep the dynasty secure. He handed out lands, titles, and stipends as if the empire's wealth were limitless. Relatives were granted estates, cousins received sinecures, and powerful clans were allowed to amass fortunes that rivaled the treasury itself. At first, it looked like stability, a well-fed aristocracy, loyal because they were richly rewarded. But beneath the surface, it was creating a dangerous imbalance. Think of it like a great tree. On the outside, it appeared lush, its branches heavy with leaves. But inside the trunk, termites had begun their work. By empowering aristocratic families so heavily, the emperor weakened the central state. The officials who staffed government offices increasingly came from these powerful clans, and loyalty shifted not toward the throne but toward family networks. Decision-making was colored by private interests, policies skewed to benefit estates and lineages, and the court began to resemble a marketplace where influence was bought and sold rather than a council where the empire's needs were debated. This aristocratic dominance wasn't just political, it was economic. Vast estates spread across the countryside, controlled by wealthy clans who relied on tenant farmers and laborers bound to their land. These estates grew so large that tax revenue to the central government dwindled. Why? Because the aristocrats were skilled at shielding their wealth, and the emperor, bound by his own generosity, lacked the will to challenge them. The burden of taxation fell increasingly on the ordinary peasantry, who had the least ability to pay. While nobles feasted on delicacies and composed poetry in their gardens, villagers scraped together grain to meet quotas that always seemed heavier than the year before. What makes this especially tragic is that Emperor Wu genuinely believed he was building loyalty and peace. He wasn't blind to the risks, but he thought the bonds of kinship and gratitude would outweigh ambition. History would prove him wrong. These same aristocratic families, grown fat and entitled, would later treat the throne as a pawn in their private struggles. Even at court, whispers grew. Ministers who cared for the empire's long-term health worried about the emperor's policies. Some counseled restraint, suggesting that unchecked indulgence could weaken the dynasty. But their voices were drowned out by flatterers who assured the emperor his generosity was proof of benevolence. And perhaps, in the haze of prosperity, he believed them. After all, the treasuries still flowed with silver, the granaries still brimmed with grain, and the people, though burdened, had not yet revolted. The cracks, though, were visible to anyone looking closely. Military readiness began to falter as resources were diverted to fund aristocratic lifestyles. Officials grew complacent, more interested in securing advantageous marriages and family alliances than strengthening the state. Laws became negotiable for those wealthy enough to bend them. And slowly, the balance of power shifted. The emperor still sat on the throne, but real authority began to slip from his grasp. This was the paradox of Jin's early peace. It appeared stable, yet the very structures meant to secure that stability were hollowing out the core of the dynasty. A bloated aristocracy, enjoying the fruits of imperial favor, was simultaneously eroding the foundation that supported the throne. The dynasty glittered in the sunlight, but the shadows beneath grew darker with every passing year. And when peace is built on fragile foundations, the first tremor is all it takes to bring the structure crashing down. That tremor would come not from foreign enemies, but from within the palace itself, where the question of succession turned family bonds into knives. Emperor Wu believed that surrounding himself with family would anchor his dynasty. Blood, he thought, was the strongest bond. Surely the men who shared his lineage would safeguard the house of Sima. And so he filled the court with brothers, cousins, and nephews, granting them princely titles, land, and the right to command troops. On the surface, it looked like a masterstroke, loyalty ensured through kinship. But anyone who has lived in a large family knows that blood ties are often just as fertile a ground for rivalry as for loyalty. The emperor's decision to distribute power among so many relatives planted the seeds of chaos. These princes, armed with soldiers and fortified by wealth, began to view themselves not simply as caretakers of the dynasty, but as rightful players in the imperial game. Each prince had his own advisors, his own loyalists, and his own ambitions. The palace, once unified in ceremony, became a nest of competing interests, whispers, and plots. And then there was the problem of succession. Emperor Wu's son, Sima Zhang, later known as Emperor Hui, was chosen as heir. But Sima Zhang was not suited to rule. Accounts describe him as simple-minded, easily manipulated, and unfit for the complexities of governing. It was a cruel twist of fate. The founder of the dynasty, who had conquered a fractured realm, would hand the throne to a man incapable of holding it steady. Everyone at court knew it, yet tradition and filial duty kept him in place as crown prince. To remove him would have invited scandal, but to keep him meant the empire's stability rested on fragile shoulders. The princes knew this. Some quietly prepared to act as protectors of the heir, anticipating that real power would fall to whichever of them controlled the throne. Others bided their time, waiting for the inevitable struggles that would follow the old emperor's death. Even Emperor Wu himself seemed torn. He worried about his son's ability to rule, yet he trusted that the network of relatives he had empowered would guide and protect him. It was, in retrospect, a dangerous gamble. Placing a weak heir in a strong family was like throwing meat into a pit of wolves and expecting them to share. The seeds of trouble were not just political, but deeply personal. Sibling rivalries festered, marriages between powerful clans and princes became power blocks, and rumors circulated through the capital about who might seize influence when the time came. The court's glittering facade, its banquets, its poetry, its rituals, hid the fact that every noble eye was fixed on the throne, measuring how long the old emperor would last and what might follow. When Emperor Wu died in 290, the delicate balance collapsed. His vision of unity through family had backfired spectacularly. Instead of standing together, the princes turned on each other, each convinced he was best suited to guard or even control the throne. The seeds planted in generosity now sprouted into the thorns of rivalry. The empire, still fresh from its unification and seemingly strong, was about to be dragged into one of the most destructive internal conflicts in its history. What began as succession disputes would soon spiral into all-out civil war, the infamous War of the Eight Princes. When Emperor Hui ascended the throne in 290, the empire expected continuity. After all, the land was unified, the treasury still had reserves, and the banners of Jin flew from north to south. Yet the man now sitting on the dragon throne was no leader. Sima Zhang, known to history as Emperor Hui, had a gentle heart but lacked the mind and strength for rulership. Court chroniclers describe him as slow in thought, easily swayed, and unable to grasp the weight of imperial decisions. He wasn't cruel, nor was he deliberately negligent, he was simply unfit. This unfitness might not have mattered if the machinery of state had been strong enough to function without him. In earlier dynasties, regents and ministers had often governed behind weak emperors, maintaining stability while keeping the ruler as a ceremonial figure. But in Jin, the balance of power had already tilted dangerously. The aristocracy was bloated, the princes were armed and ambitious, and the court was a battlefield of whispers. To place a fragile man at the center of such a storm was like dropping a candle into dry straw. His empress, Jia Nafeng, quickly stepped into the vacuum. Intelligent, ruthless, and fiercely ambitious, she became the de facto ruler. At first, her influence seemed necessary. Someone had to speak and decide in the emperor's name. But Jia Nanfeng's methods were brutal. She eliminated rivals, manipulated decrees, and consolidated power for herself and her allies. She was not content to merely protect the emperor's throne, she intended to wield it. And that made her the enemy of every prince and faction who believed they, too, should be the empire's guardian. The tragedy of Emperor Hui was that he became both shield and pawn. His name justified actions he never understood. One prince raised armies to protect the emperor from corrupt ministers. Another faction claimed to rescue the emperor from his domineering empress. Letters and proclamations flew across the empire, all written in his name, though the man himself likely had little grasp of what was happening. Imagine the confusion, armies clashing, cities burning, and yet the supposed son of heaven sat in his palace, barely comprehending that he was the excuse for it all. The court, once a glittering symbol of unity, dissolved into suspicion. Ministers whispered of plots, eunuchs carried secret messages, generals chose sides not out of loyalty but survival. Jia Nanfeng's heavy-handed rule earned her both fear and hatred. Eventually, her grip slipped, and she was overthrown by the very forces she tried to control. But her fall didn't restore order, it only opened the gates to further chaos. Emperor Hui himself endured humiliation after humiliation. At one point, he was even taken captive, carted from one faction to another like a prize. His role as emperor had shrunk to a cruel parody, a seal to be stamped, a face to parade, a symbol stripped of substance. Rarely in Chinese history has a ruler been so utterly powerless while chaos raged in his name. The tragedy is double-edged. For the man himself, whose life was one of confusion, manipulation, and indignity. And for the empire, which had pinned its hopes on the stability of succession, only to find that its emperor was incapable of steering the ship. His weakness didn't just expose the fractures in Jin's foundations, it deepened them. And soon, those fractures would widen into gaping wounds as princes turned their ambitions into open war. The spark that set the empire ablaze came almost immediately after Emperor Hui's enthronement. With Jia Nanfeng clinging to authority and the emperor too weak to resist, the princes, each armed with their own soldiers, estates, and ambitions, saw opportunity. The empire was rich and vast, but it was also vulnerable, and everyone knew that whoever controlled the emperor controlled the realm. What followed would be remembered grimly as the War of the Eight Princes, a civil conflict that turned the dynasty's dream of unity into a nightmare of betrayal, blood, and ruin. At its heart, the war wasn't about ideology or reform. It was about power. 8 members of the imperial clan, all descendants of Sima Yi, vied for dominance. Each proclaimed loyalty to the emperor, each claimed to be protecting him, and each accused his rivals of treachery. The irony was staggering. While they waved banners declaring themselves guardians of the dynasty, their armies slaughtered fellow countrymen, burned cities, and drained the very empire they swore to preserve. The first clashes erupted over the regency. Who had the right to guide an emperor incapable of ruling? Jia Nanfeng wanted the throne's power in her own hands, but princes like Sima Liang and Sima Wei believed they had the mandate as imperial uncles. Decrees flew back and forth, soldiers were called to arms, and soon blood stained the streets of the capital itself. Jia struck first, orchestrating purges and executions that temporarily secured her position. But her violence only fueled resentment, and princes began to raise banners across the provinces, summoning their troops to march on the court. The cycle became painfully predictable. One prince declared himself protector of the emperor, only to be outmaneuvered by another who accused him of overreach. Armies met in battle. One side triumphed, and then within months another prince rose in revolt. The emperor, shuttled from faction to faction, lent legitimacy to whichever warlord held him captive at the time. From Luoyang to Chang'an, palaces changed hands, ministers were executed, and soldiers pillaged the countryside. The people, ordinary farmers and townsfolk who had so recently believed unity would bring peace, suffered most. Crops burned, homes were abandoned, and whole communities were displaced. It's difficult to overstate the devastation. This wasn't a single war with a clear arc. It was a rolling series of conflicts that spanned nearly 2 decades, dragging the dynasty deeper into ruin. Soldiers became pawns in aristocratic games, and loyalty shifted constantly, not to the throne, but to whoever offered better pay or more protection. By the time one prince gained a temporary advantage, his rivals were already conspiring against him. The empire, once wealthy and full of promise, began to bleed out. The War of the Eight Princes is sometimes described in chronicles with an almost weary tone, as if even historians grew tired of recounting the endless betrayals. Yet the consequences were monumental. The conflict hollowed out the dynasty's strength, left the people disillusioned, and opened the doors to enemies beyond the borders who had long watched for weakness. What had begun as a quarrel within one family became the slow-motion unraveling of an empire. And in the center of it all sat Emperor Hui, a silent, bewildered figure, his name invoked to justify bloodshed he could not understand. The dynasty that had promised stability was devouring itself from within, and every victory on the battlefield only deepened the fractures. The Jin had united the realm in name, but in truth, the War of the Eight Princes shattered the empire more thoroughly than any external enemy could have dreamed. Luoyang, once the proud heart of the empire, turned into a theater of suspicion and treachery. The court that had celebrated unification now seethed with intrigue, where every smile concealed a dagger and every banquet could end with an execution order. Ambition filled the air as thick as incense, choking out the last traces of harmony. Princes, ministers, generals, and consorts all jostled for position, each certain that heaven favored their cause. What had begun as family rivalry morphed into a political nightmare, one where trust was a liability and betrayal the only reliable currency. Inside the palace, allegiances shifted as quickly as the seasons. One month, a prince might be hailed as savior of the throne, his name carved into proclamations, his authority endorsed by the emperor's seal. The next month, he might find himself accused of treason, his allies slaughtered, his head displayed as a warning. Eunuchs and court officials, once mere functionaries, became power brokers, their whispers in the emperor's ear carrying more weight than entire armies. Letters of loyalty poured in from provinces, but each was written with hesitation. Everyone knew that today's loyalist could be tomorrow's traitor, depending on who controlled the capital. Jia Nanfeng's fall only worsened the spiral. Her ruthlessness had kept some factions in check, but once she was gone, the palace became a free-for-all. Ministers tried to act as mediators, urging restraint, but their words fell on deaf ears. Greed and fear spoke louder. Those who hesitated were accused of disloyalty. Those who acted boldly risked annihilation. The court became a place where even kinship meant nothing. Brothers plotted against brothers, uncles betrayed nephews, and cousins conspired to poison or exile one another. The emperor himself drifted through this storm, bewildered and pliant. One day, he was paraded in support of one faction. The next day, he was presented as justification for their enemy's rebellion. His seal was stamped on edicts he could not read, his presence invoked in battles he could not command. He was less a ruler than a relic, sacred enough to preserve, powerless enough to control. In truth, the court didn't revolve around him anymore. It revolved around who could hold him hostage. And all the while, the city of Luoyang, once vibrant and majestic, began to crack under the weight of endless conflict. Palaces were looted, granaries emptied, commoners conscripted into wars they didn't believe in. For the people of the capital, the grand marble halls and vermilion gates became symbols not of imperial glory but of chaos. The empire's heart had become its bleeding wound. Ambition devoured loyalty, betrayal became routine, and survival overshadowed principle. The court, meant to embody stability and virtue, had transformed into a stage where everyone played the role of guardian while secretly sharpening the blade for their rivals. And as the capital tore itself apart, the provinces grew restless and enemies beyond the frontier began to stir. The dynasty's greatest threat was no longer the southern rivers or northern horsemen. It was the unquenchable hunger of its own aristocracy, gnawing the empire from the inside out. The soldiers of Jin had once been the pride of a unified realm, hardened veterans who had carried the banners of Sima Yan across rivers and mountains to complete the conquest of Wu. They had tasted victory, marched through cheering towns, and believed themselves guardians of an empire reborn. But as the War of the Eight Princes dragged on, those same soldiers became something else entirely, not defenders of the dynasty, but pawns in aristocratic games, marched from one battlefield to another for causes they barely understood. Every prince who raised a banner claimed legitimacy. Each proclaimed that he alone acted in the name of the emperor, that his war was righteous while his rival's was rebellion. To the soldier in the ranks, the difference was meaningless. Orders came, rations were distributed, and they marched wherever their commander pointed. One year, a man might find himself fighting under the banner of one imperial uncle. The next, he might be conscripted by another prince claiming to save the throne from corruption. Loyalty wasn't to dynasty or ideology, it was to survival. The toll was brutal. Campaigns that should have been short devolved into drawn-out clashes across provinces. Armies stripped the land bare, seizing grain from peasants who had nothing left to give. Soldiers, unpaid for months, turned to looting, their discipline fraying with each new campaign. It's easy to imagine the weariness that must have set in, the endless marching, the empty promises of commanders, the blood spilled for causes that shifted with every decree. Many deserted, slipping away into forests or returning to their villages in the dead of night. Others surrendered outright to rival princes, hoping for better treatment or simply out of exhaustion. And yet, the cycle continued. Princes needed armies to assert their claims, so they squeezed peasants into conscription and taxed provinces dry to equip troops. Generals, once loyal to the dynasty, now served whichever prince offered the greatest rewards. In effect, the empire's military became fragmented, no longer a unified force, but a patchwork of private armies serving personal ambitions. The common soldier bore the worst of it. He fought not for glory, but for the survival of his family back home, hoping his meager pay or plunder might feed them through another season. He watched comrades die on battlefields where neither side truly represented the empire he thought he served. He saw commanders switch allegiances and wondered whether his own blood meant anything to men who treated soldiers as expendable. For the aristocrats, soldiers were tokens, necessary tools to outmaneuver rivals. For the soldiers, war had become a grinding machine that consumed lives without purpose. And for the people left behind in villages and towns, those soldiers were both protectors and predators, sometimes arriving to guard against bandits, sometimes to seize the very harvest that kept families alive. In this way, the once proud armies of Jin became hollowed out, their spirit drained, their unity shattered. They were no longer the sharp spear of a dynasty, but the blunt instrument of infighting nobles. And as the empire bled its strength on itself, enemies beyond its borders watched and waited. The empire bled in ways no battlefield report could fully capture. While princes schemed in Luoyang and armies clashed across the provinces, the people bore the true cost. Fields lay untended because farmers had been dragged into armies or had fled from advancing troops. Grain stores were plundered by soldiers who swore they were protecting the emperor, but in reality were just hungry men following orders. Harvests shrank, prices soared, and famine spread like a shadow across the countryside. For villagers, life became a grim calculus: stay in one's home and risk soldiers stripping it bare, or abandon everything and wander in search of safety. Entire communities packed up and fled, leaving behind fields overgrown with weeds and villages that became ghostly shells. The great rivers that once carried goods and life now carried waves of refugees drifting southward. Families were torn apart on the roads, some perished from hunger, others from disease. The empire's dream of peace, so vivid after unification, now felt like a cruel joke whispered by fate. And famine never travels alone, it always brings rebellion in its wake. When the people have nothing left to lose, they rise. Local uprisings erupted, some small, others large enough to unsettle the already fractured state. Peasants armed themselves with farm tools, driven not by ideology but desperation. Charismatic rebels appeared, promising justice, food, or protection from marauding armies. Some declared themselves heaven's chosen, others claimed simply to right the wrongs of corrupt officials. For the court in Luoyang, These uprisings were an embarrassment, proof that the dynasty had lost touch with its people. But instead of healing the wounds, princes treated rebellions as yet another excuse to march armies, further draining resources and spreading devastation. The famine's grip reached even into the capital. Markets once filled with rice and millet became barren. Bread cost fortunes, meat became a luxury seen only on aristocrats' tables. Rumors spread of people eating bark, grass, even the bodies of the dead. Chroniclers, in tones both horrified and resigned, wrote of entire counties where the sound of chickens and dogs was no longer heard. Silence replaced the bustle of rural life. Meanwhile, the imperial treasury strained under the weight of constant campaigns. To fund their wars, princes demanded more taxes, squeezing blood from stones. Officials extorted villagers, taking not just grain but clothing, tools, even children sold into servitude. The dynasty wasn't just bleeding, it was cannibalizing its own body. And yet, the princes, blinded by ambition, rarely looked beyond their immediate rivalries. Each believed victory over his cousin would restore order, never realizing that the greater enemy was the slow unraveling of society itself. When famine and rebellion spread unchecked, the empire's foundation cracked. What had once been the dream of a unified realm now resembled a wasteland dotted with fortresses and war camps, where power shifted daily and survival was never guaranteed. The tragedy was that all this suffering had no noble cause, no grand vision guiding it. The people starved not because of foreign invasion or natural disaster alone, but because their rulers devoured the very land they were sworn to protect. And in that vacuum of strength, new eyes turned toward China's heartland, eyes belonging to those who had long watched from beyond its borders, waiting for the moment when Jin would be too weak to resist. Beyond the northern frontier, a different kind of stillness hung in the air. The tribes who had long lived in the shadow of China's great dynasties, the Xiongnu, the Jia, the Xinbei, the Di, and others, watched the Jin court devour itself. For generations, they had tested China's borders, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading, sometimes even serving as mercenaries in Chinese armies. They had known both the strength and the arrogance of the empire, and often they had been forced to submit when its armies marched north in unified strength. But now the picture was changing. The once mighty dynasty was tearing itself apart, its soldiers fighting each other, its fields lying fallow, its people starving. To the tribes beyond the passes, this was opportunity. The northern steppes had never been truly quiet. Horsemen rode fast across open grasslands, herding cattle, hunting, and raiding when they needed resources. For them, strength was survival, and weakness was an invitation. Reports flowed in from merchants and scouts. The Jin armies were exhausted, the treasury drained, Luoyang trembling under constant factional strife. What had once been a formidable wall of imperial defense now looked more like a crumbling gate. Many of these groups were not simply outsiders. They had been woven into the fabric of the empire in complicated ways. Some had lived within Chinese borders for generations, settling in farming communities, but still retaining their tribal identities. Others served as auxiliary soldiers, pledged to protect the empire in exchange for land or favor. They knew the rhythms of Chinese politics intimately, and they understood that when a dynasty grew weak, there was profit to be made. Some leaders dreamed of carving out kingdoms of their own, no longer content to be vassals. Others simply wanted to plunder and return to the steppe richer than before. Imagine the perspective of a Xiongnu chieftain watching the Jin princes destroy one another. He would have remembered how the empire once rode out in full force, how its armies could crush rebellions and defend walls with terrifying efficiency. But now those same armies were scattered, distracted, hollowed out by civil war. Why not strike? Why not take the cities and fields that lay undefended? At first, the tribes tested cautiously, sending raiding parties across the border. When resistance was weak, they pushed further, taking cattle, slaves, and grain. Each success emboldened them. Chinese peasants along the frontier, already crushed by famine, suddenly found themselves facing mounted raiders burning their villages. Some resisted, others fled south. And as chaos spread, The frontier began to collapse, not in one great invasion, but in a steady erosion, as wave after wave chipped away at Jin's control. By the turn of the century, the situation was dire. Entire provinces in the north slipped out of imperial control, either falling to tribal warlords or becoming no man's lands where neither Jin authority nor local order could survive. These weren't isolated raids anymore. They were the early foundations of rival states forming within the empire's borders. And yet, in Luoyang, the princes remained locked in their bitter struggle. Their eyes were fixed on one another, blind to the storm gathering beyond the walls. It was as though the dynasty had been so consumed by its own reflection that it failed to notice the shadows creeping closer. The tribes, once outsiders, were now poised to become central players in the empire's story. Soon, their patience would end, and their strikes would no longer be small raids, but full-scale invasions aimed at the very heart of Jin's power. And when that moment came, the dynasty, already bleeding from within, would find itself incapable of resisting the tide. The hammer finally fell in the early 4th century, and it came from the very people the Jin had once thought contained within their borders. Among the Xiongnu, a powerful chieftain named Lu Yuan had been watching closely. Unlike a simple raider, Lu Yuan understood Chinese politics, culture, and language. He had even been educated in the Confucian classics. To him, the Jin civil wars were more than weakness. They were an invitation to claim legitimacy. He declared himself heir to the old Han legacy, adopting the dynastic title to rally both his fellow Xiongnu and disillusioned Chinese who still longed for the Han name. His followers swelled, drawn by the promise of a new order rising from the ashes of Jin's collapse. The initial strikes were swift and brutal. Jin garrisons, starved of supplies and exhausted by decades of internal war, crumbled under the pressure. Frontier towns fell in rapid succession. Refugees poured southward, carrying with them tales of fire and slaughter. To those who heard, the stories must have felt like nightmares returning. The unity so recently celebrated was vanishing into smoke. And then came the march on Luoyang. The capital, once the jewel of the empire, had already been weakened by factional struggles. Its defenses were underfunded, its walls undermanned, its spirit broken. When the Xiongnu forces approached, panic rippled through the city. Ministers argued over how to respond, some urged negotiation, others demanded desperate defense. The emperor, still Emperor Hui, was helpless, caught in the tide of indecision. The invaders breached the city in 311. What followed was a catastrophe etched into the chronicles with horror. Luoyang was sacked. Palaces burned, temples crumbled, and libraries, filled with centuries of knowledge, were reduced to ash. Soldiers cut down officials in the streets, noble women were taken captive, and commoners slaughtered by the thousands. It wasn't simply a military defeat, it was the symbolic shattering of the dynasty's heart. The capital of unity had become the graveyard of its dreams. Emperor Hui himself was taken prisoner, a humiliation almost unthinkable in the long arc of Chinese imperial history. The Son of Heaven, the supposed pivot of the cosmos, now sat in the custody of foreign horsemen. His seal meant nothing, his name a hollow echo. To the people, it must have seemed as though heaven had abandoned the dynasty entirely. The fall of Luoyang was not just the loss of a city, it was the rupture of legitimacy. An emperor in captivity was no emperor at all. Officials fled, provinces splintered, and local strongmen began ruling as they pleased. The dynasty that had promised unification now looked like a broken vessel, leaking power from every seam. And yet, the suffering didn't end there. In 316, the secondary capital at Chang'an fell as well, sealing the fate of northern Jin. Another emperor, Emperor Min, was captured, dragged in chains before his conquerors. For the first time in centuries, both the capital and the Son of Heaven were in enemy hands. The dynasty's aura of divine protection had been obliterated. From that point forward, the empire was no longer a single body, but a fragmented corpse. In the north, new regimes, built by Xiongnu, Jie, Xianbei, and others, sprang up amid the ruins, each claiming authority in lands once firmly under Chinese dynastic control. In the south, Jin remnants fled across the Yangtze, clinging to survival in exile. The sack of Luoyang marked the end of any illusion that the dynasty could simply weather its internal storms. The storm had come from outside, and it had torn the heart out of Jin. What remained was not recovery, but a desperate struggle to survive it all. The fall of Luoyang was a wound, but the fall of Chang'an was the killing blow. After the Xiongnu sack of the first capital, many had hoped that retreating westward to Chang'an, the ancient fortress city nestled between mountains and rivers, would buy time. Chang'an had been a capital for dynasties before, a place of thick walls and deep history, where emperors once projected strength across the world. But by the 310s, it was no longer a bastion of confidence. It was a refuge for the desperate. Emperor Hui had already been dragged away in humiliation, a son of heaven reduced to a hostage. His successor, Emperor Min, tried to gather what scraps of authority remained, though in truth his throne was little more than a seat atop shifting sands. His officials urged resistance. Loyal generals scraped together armies from the scattered remnants of northern provinces. They fortified gates, prepared supplies, and sent desperate calls for aid. Yet the Jin state was already hollow. The countryside was ravaged, the treasury empty, and the very people they claimed to protect were fleeing by the thousands. In 316, the storm broke. Liu Yao, cousin of Liu Yuan and commander of the Xiongnu forces, marched on Chang'an. The city, weakened by famine and unrest, could not withstand the siege. Within months, its walls were breached. The defenders, hungry and exhausted, surrendered en masse. Emperor Min was captured, dragged before the conqueror like a criminal rather than a sovereign. His robes of state, once symbols of heaven's mandate, did nothing to shield him from mockery. Chronicles describe him sitting in chains, forced to bow before a man his ancestors would have called a barbarian chieftain. The humiliation was complete. The collapse of Chang'an marked the official end of Jin authority in the north. With both Luoyang and Chang'an in enemy hands, the dynasty's legitimacy shattered beyond repair. Two emperors, Hui and Min, had been paraded as captives. For the Chinese world, steeped in the belief that the Son of Heaven was sacred and untouchable, this was more than defeat, it was cosmic disarray. If the emperor could be chained, if capitals could be torched, then what did heaven's mandate mean anymore? The people bore the consequences in ways almost too heavy to recount. Cities emptied, villages vanished, and entire populations drifted southward, crossing rivers in ragged caravans. Chroniclers tell of families starving on the roads, of mothers leaving infants by the roadside when they could no longer carry them. Northern China, once the cradle of dynasties, became a graveyard of burned fields and abandoned towns. Into that vacuum poured new states, ruled by Xiongnu, Jia, Di, and Xianbei leaders. Collectively, historians would call this the era of the 16 kingdoms, but at the time, it must have felt like the very earth had splintered. And yet, the dynasty was not gone altogether. South of the Yangtze River, loyalist officials and surviving members of the Sima clan regrouped. They ferried what remained of the court to Jiankang, a city near the fertile lower Yangtze. From there, they proclaimed the continuation of the dynasty, calling it the Eastern Jin. But the truth was unavoidable. The Jin of the north had died in humiliation, its emperors reduced to captives, its heartland carved up by powers who had once been dismissed as outsiders. The fall of Chang'an was not simply the end of a capital. It was the symbolic end of northern Jin's mandate. What remained was exile, survival, and the faint hope that a dynasty so deeply wounded could find a way to endure on the far side of the river. The vacuum left by the fall of Luoyang and Chang'an didn't stay empty for long. Out of the ruins of northern Jin, new regimes sprouted almost overnight, led not by Han Chinese aristocrats, but by peoples who had long lived on the margins of the empire. The Xiongnu, Jia, Xianbei, Di, and Chang, names that once conjured images of steppe riders and frontier tribes, now flew their own banners over cities that had once been the heart of Chinese civilization. What had been dismissed as raiding bands or auxiliary allies transformed into kingdoms in their own right. Historians would later label this fractured age the time of the 16 kingdoms, though in truth there were more than 16 states if one counts every claimant and petty regime. Each was led by ambitious rulers who saw in Jin's weakness the chance to build dynasties of their own. Some, like the Xiongnu under Lu Yuan and his successors, cloaked themselves in Chinese tradition. They adopted dynastic names, proclaimed themselves heirs of Han, and performed Confucian rites. Others leaned into their own heritage, ruling with the rough vigor of steppe chieftains but adapting quickly to the administrative systems they had inherited. For the people of the north, the change was bewildering. Imagine living in a village outside Luoyang. One year the emperor's tax collectors arrive, demanding grain for the Jin court. The next, Xiongnu horsemen fly banners of Han, declaring themselves the rightful rulers. A season later, another warlord storms through, replacing banners again. Authority was no longer stable or sacred, it shifted with the tide of war. Families learned to keep their heads down, to pledge loyalty to whoever held power in the moment, just to survive. Culturally, this mixing of peoples created a strange and often violent fusion. Non-Han rulers married Han aristocrats to secure legitimacy. Chinese bureaucrats, desperate to preserve order, served in the courts of foreign kings. Soldiers from the steppes learned to fight in Chinese-style formations, while peasants learned to fear the thunder of horse hooves more than imperial decrees. The old hierarchy of civilized center and barbarian frontier blurred until it was almost meaningless. Some of these new regimes thrived briefly, flashing like meteors before collapsing under their own instability. Others endured longer, carving out serious claims to legitimacy. But together, they shattered any hope that the North would return quickly to Jin control. What had once been the dynasty's richest heartland was now a patchwork of rival states, each taxing, conscripting, and exploiting the population. For the common people, survival meant navigating the shifting allegiances of rulers who spoke different tongues and upheld different traditions. For the Sima clan and their loyalists who had fled south, this was a haunting reality. They still called themselves emperors of all under heaven, but in truth, half the realm was lost, dominated by rulers who owed them nothing. Worse still, these non-Han kingdoms didn't simply raid and retreat, they built capitals, minted coins, and styled themselves as heirs to the Chinese imperial order. The Sima claim to legitimacy now had competitors who blended foreign origin with Chinese political tradition, undermining the very foundation of the dynasty's existence. The rise of these northern states signaled a new era of fragmentation. For centuries, the idea of one son of heaven ruling all of China had been the guiding principle of order. Now, there were many claimants, each with their own mandate, their own armies, their own vision of what empire meant. The Jin still lived, but it lived in exile, watching from across the river as the land that once belonged to its founders became the stage for a new, fractured order. The collapse of the north sent waves of people surging southward, a human tide of officials, nobles, soldiers, and peasants all fleeing the chaos. Caravans clogged the roads, boats overflowed on the rivers, and entire communities uprooted themselves to escape the devastation. The Yangtze River became more than just a geographic boundary, it became the lifeline of a dynasty in retreat. South of its wide waters lay fertile plains and rugged hills that had long been considered peripheral to the empire's political heart. Now, those southern lands became the final refuge of Jin authority. Among those who crossed the river were members of the Sima clan itself, determined to keep the dynasty alive. They carried the imperial seals, what remained of the treasury, and the conviction, perhaps stubborn, perhaps desperate, that as long as a Sima sat on the throne, the dynasty still held the mandate of heaven. In 317, the court was re-established at Jiankang, a city near the lower Yangtze that would become the capital of what historians call the Eastern Jin. Jiankang was not Luoyang or Chang'an. It lacked their ancient grandeur, their sprawling palaces, their aura of inevitability. It was a city of rivers and canals, surrounded by fertile farmland, but still on the edge of what northern elites had long considered civilized China. For many refugees, the South felt foreign, different dialects, different customs, different landscapes. Yet it was also safe, defended by the broad sweep of the Yangtze, which acted as a natural barrier against northern horsemen. The dynasty had traded the heartland for survival. The flight to the south was more than political. It was cultural. Aristocrats carried with them northern traditions, Confucian texts, family records, and even ancestral tablets. They rebuilt shrines and halls, transplanting their world into alien soil. Southern society, once considered rustic and secondary, suddenly became the center of Chinese political life. The mix of local gentry and northern émigrés created a new, hybrid culture, one that would shape China for centuries to come. Poetry flourished, calligraphy reached new heights, and Buddhism spread more deeply as both solace and philosophy in an age of displacement. But survival came at a cost. The Eastern Jin court never forgot that it had lost the north. Every proclamation, every ritual at Jiankang was filled with references to restoring the Central Plains and reclaiming the dynasty's heartland. In reality, those lands were firmly in the grip of non-Han states. The court's map still painted all under heaven as Jin territory, but everyone knew the truth. Their rule was limited, fragile, and defined more by the river they hid behind than the mandate they claimed. And the dynasty's dependence on aristocratic clans only deepened in exile. With the central government weakened and revenues diminished, powerful families, many of them refugees themselves, became the real backbone of the state. They supplied soldiers, grain, and legitimacy, but they also demanded influence, titles, and autonomy. The emperor, far from ruling absolutely, became a figure balanced precariously on the shoulders of noble clans who saw him as both a necessity and a pawn. The flight to the south saved the dynasty from extinction, but it also marked a transformation. Jin was no longer the dynasty that had unified China. It was a dynasty clinging to survival, claiming authority over lands it could no longer touch, building its future on soil that had never before borne the weight of an imperial capital. The people could not know it then, but this southern shift would echo across centuries, laying the groundwork for a recurring pattern in Chinese history. When the north falls, the south becomes the refuge. The arc that carries the flame of legitimacy until the storm passes. The rebirth of the dynasty in Jiankang was less a triumphant founding than a desperate act of preservation. In 317, the surviving scion of the Sima clan, Sima Rui, declared himself emperor. He chose Jiankang, a city once known as Jianya under the old state of Wu, as his capital. By doing so, he wrapped his claim in layers of symbolism. The dynasty would not vanish, it would adapt. The mandate of heaven had not been lost, only relocated. To the refugees huddled south of the Yangtze, weary and broken, this proclamation was more than politics. It was hope, however fragile, that the world still had order. Jiankang itself was an unlikely capital. Surrounded by rivers, lakes, and marshland, it lacked the monumental grandeur of Luoyang or Chang'an. It was a city of waterways and markets, more accustomed to regional trade than imperial ceremony. Yet in that very geography lay its strength. The Yangtze River was a barrier northern horsemen could rarely breach, and the lush lands of the lower river valley promised food and resources to sustain a court in exile. The choice was practical as much as symbolic. If the dynasty was to survive, it needed defensible ground. The arrival of northern aristocrats transformed Jiankang almost overnight. Grand halls were built to mimic the palaces they had lost, Confucian rituals reinstated, and genealogies carefully preserved to remind everyone that the Sima line still carried legitimacy. Scholars copied texts, poets composed laments for the fallen capitals, and artists sought to capture the melancholy grandeur of a dynasty displaced. This mingling of northern traditions with southern landscapes produced a new cultural vibrancy. Calligraphy, in particular, blossomed. Wang Shiji, who would become the most celebrated calligrapher in Chinese history, thrived in this very environment. Out of exile's pain came artistic brilliance. Yet politically, the Eastern Jin was fragile from the start. Its emperor sat on the throne, but they did not truly rule. Power rested in the hands of great aristocratic families, Wang, Xia, Huan, who had brought their wealth, soldiers, and followers south. These clans considered themselves partners in governance, not mere subjects. Without them, the court could not muster armies or collect taxes. With them, the emperor became little more than the first among nobles, dependent on their goodwill. It was a dangerous balance, one that gave the dynasty resilience, but robbed it of authority. The court also lived under the shadow of its own rhetoric. Every ritual proclaimed the emperor, son of heaven, ruler of all under heaven. Maps still depicted the north as Jin territory. Edicts promised campaigns to retake Luoyang and Chang'an. But these were words, not realities. In truth, the eastern Jin was a regional state pretending to be an empire. The contradiction was never resolved. To admit weakness would be to abandon legitimacy, but to act on their promises of reconquest was beyond their strength. So the dynasty survived in a strange in-between, sovereign in the south, aspirant in the north, caught between memory and reality. For the ordinary people of the south, this was a mixed blessing. On one hand, the influx of refugees brought culture, trade, and a sense of connection to the great traditions of the north. On the other, they also brought burdens. Taxes rose, land was seized, and local families often resented the dominance of newcomers who carried themselves with an air of superiority. The South was no longer a quiet frontier, it was now the heart of a dynasty in exile. Still, the very survival of Jin was remarkable. Against the backdrop of burning capitals and captured emperors, the dynasty had refused to die. It had carried its rituals, its seals, its ancestral tablets across the river and planted them in new soil. Out of loss came continuity, and out of displacement came reinvention. Jiankang might not have been Luoyang, but for more than a century, it would serve as the ark that preserved the dynasty's flickering flame. From the moment the eastern Jin settled in Jiankang, its emperors lived under the long shadow of the very men who had saved the dynasty. The great clans families like the Wang, the Xia, and later the Huan were indispensable. They had the wealth, the private armies, the estates, and the networks to keep the state alive. Without them, the court could not collect taxes, defend its borders, or even enforce decrees. But with them, the emperor was never truly sovereign. His throne sat atop a foundation owned by others. This fragile legitimacy was obvious to anyone who looked closely. The emperor presided over grand rituals, received tribute, and signed edicts, yet in practice, he often functioned more as a ceremonial figure than a ruler. It was the aristocratic clans who decided strategy, who appointed governors, who led campaigns. When an emperor tried to assert himself too forcefully, he found his orders ignored, or worse, quietly undermined. The balance was delicate: push too hard against the clans and risk rebellion, lean too heavily on them and reduce the throne to a puppet. The clans themselves were not blind to this. They cloaked their dominance in rhetoric of loyalty, always professing devotion to the imperial house. But behind closed doors, their priority was preserving their own influence. Marriages between great families cemented alliances, provincial appointments went to their protégés, and even military campaigns were launched more to protect clan interests than to restore imperial authority. The dynasty became less a unified government and more a federation of aristocratic networks, loosely held together by the fiction of an emperor in Jiankang. This arrangement created constant tension. Some emperors tried to tip the balance back toward the throne. They cultivated eunuchs, minor officials, or lesser gentry as counterweights to the great clans. They issued edicts reminding nobles that ultimate authority rested with the Son of Heaven. Yet these efforts rarely succeeded. The clans had grown too entrenched, too necessary, and too wealthy. In truth, the emperors could not do without them, even as they chafed under their dominance. For ordinary people, this power struggle often felt distant, but its effects were very real. When aristocratic families squabbled, local governance suffered. Taxes were levied inconsistently, light in regions dominated by powerful clans, crushing elsewhere. Military service was often outsourced to tenants and peasants, while aristocrats themselves shielded their estates from burdens. The dynasty's survival rested on the backs of those least able to carry it, while its most privileged families guarded their wealth like dragons on treasure. The irony is hard to miss. The Jin had fled south proclaiming the unbroken mandate of heaven, yet the throne was constantly at the mercy of men who treated the emperor as a useful symbol rather than a true master. The dynasty's legitimacy was paper-thin, strong enough to sustain ritual and tradition, but too weak to command absolute loyalty. Everyone knew it, but no one dared speak it plainly. This uneasy balance would define the Eastern Jin. Periods of cooperation between throne and clans brought stability, moments of tension threatened collapse. And always, just beyond the southern horizon, the northern states loomed, watching, waiting, and sometimes striking. For the dynasty to endure, it needed both the symbolic authority of the emperor and the practical power of the clans. Yet holding the two together was like trying to bind water in one's hand. For a while it worked, but sooner or later, it would slip through the fingers. The Eastern Jin might have found refuge behind the Yangtze, but north of that river, the landscape was a storm. The 16 kingdoms, those fractured states born from Xiongnu, Jia, Xianbei, Di, and Qing leaders, were never content to simply rule the north. Each one, whether great or small, dreamed of pressing further south, of toppling the exiled dynasty and claiming the mandate for itself. To the Eastern Jin court in Jiankang, these northern kingdoms were a constant nightmare, unpredictable, aggressive, and, at times, frighteningly powerful. What made the challenge so daunting was not just the number of these states, but their volatility. One year, a northern king might be Jin's sworn enemy. The next, he might be overthrown by his general, assassinated by his kin, or absorbed into a neighboring state. The map of northern China looked like shifting sand, changing with every season. Yet through the chaos, one thing remained constant: they all eyed the south as the final prize. For Jin, this was a cruel paradox. On the one hand, the chaos of the north meant no single rival could consolidate all of China's heartland. That gave the dynasty breathing space. On the other hand, the constant rise and fall of kingdoms meant endless raids, invasions, and threats that drained the south of resources. Jiankang lived in a permanent state of siege mentality, never knowing which northern banner might cross the river next. The greatest fear came when one of these kingdoms grew strong enough to mount a serious southern campaign. The former Zhao, founded by the Xiongnu leader Lu Yuan and later strengthened by his successors, was the first to show how dangerous the north could be. Their conquest of Luoyang and Chang'an proved that they weren't just raiders, they were empire builders. Later Zhao under Shirlo and his descendants, fierce leaders of Jia origin, pushed the boundaries even further, sending armies south and terrifying Jin's officials with their speed and ferocity. And it wasn't just military pressure. The 16 kingdoms challenged Jin ideologically. Many of their rulers adopted Chinese titles, rituals, and dynastic names. They presented themselves not as outsiders, but as rightful sons of heaven. To the ordinary people of the north, peasants struggling to survive, these claims often seemed more real than those of a distant emperor hiding behind the Yangtze. For the first time in centuries, the very idea of a single, unified Chinese ruler began to fracture. The Eastern Jin responded with caution. They fortified river crossings, built watchtowers, and stationed troops in defensive lines along the Yangtze. They rarely launched full-scale northern campaigns, knowing that their aristocratic armies lacked the discipline and cohesion for prolonged offensives. Instead, they relied on holding the river as a shield. This strategy worked. Most invasions foundered against the broad waters of the Yangtze, but it also left Jin trapped, unable to reclaim the lands it still claimed in name. For the people living in this divided world, life was precarious. Refugees continued to stream south, carrying tales of shifting rulers and endless wars in the north. In Jiankang, officials held grand rituals proclaiming the emperor's universal rule, but everyone knew the truth. The dynasty's writ ended at the riverbank. Beyond lay a patchwork of kingdoms, each more ruthless than the last, all challenging Jin's fragile claim to the mandate. This pressure shaped everything about the Eastern Jin's identity. Its emperors and clans were less focused on governing the lands they held than on surviving the lands they had lost. The 16 kingdoms were more than enemies. They were a constant reminder of failure, the embodiment of the dynasty's exile. And though most of their campaigns across the river ended in failure, one would come close to breaking the South entirely until fate, strategy, and perhaps luck combined at a place called the Fei River. By the late 4th century, the eastern Jin had survived for decades behind the Yangtze, but survival is not the same as security. To the north, the former Qin rose under the leadership of Fu Jian, a formidable ruler who dreamed of uniting all of China under his banner. Unlike the smaller northern states that squabbled and collapsed, the former Qin was disciplined, organized, and ambitious. Fu Jian looked southward and saw not just territory but destiny. In his eyes, the eastern Jin was a remnant clinging to borrowed time. He would be the one to extinguish it. In 383, he launched his grand campaign. Chronicles speak of a staggering force, nearly 1 million men, though numbers may have been inflated. Even if only a fraction is true, it was still one of the largest armies assembled in that age. The size alone was meant to terrify. Imagine being a villager along the Yangtze and hearing that an ocean of soldiers was marching south, cavalry, infantry, siege engines, all under banners proclaiming Fu Jian's mandate. To many, it must have seemed inevitable that the South would fall, just as the North had decades earlier. The Jin court panicked. Officials whispered of flight, of abandoning Jiankang and retreating further south. But against this tide of fear rose a general named Xia An, a man not celebrated for martial prowess, but for calm, steady judgment. He reassured the court, rallied the armies, and placed trust in his commanders, particularly Xia Xian, who led the elite Beifu army. While the Qin forces lumbered south with overwhelming numbers, the Jin prepared carefully, using speed, coordination, and the natural defenses of the Yangtze to their advantage. The two armies met at the Fei River in Anhui. There, in a moment that would become legend, the Jin turned weakness into strength. The Qin army, stretched thin and overconfident, allowed itself to be maneuvered. Jin generals suggested the Qin forces pull back slightly to allow them to cross the river, a ruse. When the Qin soldiers began to retreat in disorder, panic spread through their massive host. Rumors of betrayal, confusion among ranks, and the sheer size of the army turned movement into chaos. In that instant, the disciplined Jin struck. What followed was not just a victory, it was a miracle. The smaller Jin army shattered the enormous Qin host, scattering it in disarray. Fu Jian himself was wounded and forced to flee. The dream of northern conquest collapsed overnight. The eastern Jin, which had seemed on the brink of annihilation, emerged victorious, its survival secured not by overwhelming strength, but by strategy, discipline, and perhaps divine fortune. The Battle of Fei River became a symbol of resilience. For the refugees and Southerners who had long lived under the shadow of Northern might, it proved that Jin was not doomed to be a perpetual victim. Poets celebrated the victory, officials proclaimed it proof that heaven still favored the dynasty, and common people, for once, could believe that the river truly was a shield blessed by fate. Yet the victory, for all its glory, did not translate into reconquest. The dynasty lacked the unity and resources to push north and reclaim the lost capitals. Instead, it settled back into its familiar rhythm, defensive, cautious, divided between emperor and clans. The miracle at Fei River preserved Jin's life, but it also revealed the limits of what it could achieve. The dynasty could survive, yes, but could it ever thrive again? For now, though, the court in Jiankang celebrated. The banners of Fu Jian had been cast down, the northern juggernaut humbled, and the mandate, at least in southern eyes, had been reaffirmed. Against impossible odds, the dynasty had lived to see another day. The victory at Fei River sent shockwaves across the realm. For the first time in decades, the eastern Jin had not only survived an existential threat, but had humbled a northern giant. Refugees in the south who had long resigned themselves to permanent exile whispered that perhaps the mandate of heaven still lingered with the Sima house. Scholars dusted off their rhetoric about restoring the Central Plains, poets sang of heaven's favor, and the court in Jiankang erupted in ceremonies of thanksgiving. For a brief moment, hope felt real again. But victories, no matter how dazzling, cannot by themselves mend broken foundations. The Eastern Jin remained what it had been, a dynasty built on fragile compromises, where the throne relied on aristocratic clans and generals who guarded their own power as jealously as the emperor guarded his seal. The triumph at Fei River had been made possible by the discipline of the Beifu army, drilled under Xia and commanded by his nephew Xia Xian. Yet instead of this victory uniting court and clan, it highlighted the imbalance. Who truly deserved the credit? The emperor, who sat in Jiankang, or the generals and clans whose soldiers had bled for the victory? The court splintered into debates. Some called for bold offensives northward, arguing that heaven had opened the way. Others counseled caution, warning that the dynasty lacked the resources to occupy and govern vast, war-torn lands. The emperor's own voice was faint in these deliberations. He presided, but the great clans decided. Their interests did not align on aggressive campaigns. Why risk destabilizing their power at home by chasing uncertain victories abroad? So, the moment passed. Instead of pressing their advantage, the Jin let the opportunity slip, content to bask in survival rather than pursue restoration. Meanwhile, the people, those who had celebrated the miracle, continued to shoulder heavy burdens. Taxes remained inconsistent, local officials corrupt, and soldiers still conscripted when border skirmishes flared. For the peasants in rice paddies along the Yangtze or the merchants in Jiankang's markets, the hope of reclaiming the north was distant rhetoric. What mattered was whether their harvests survived raids, whether their families avoided famine, whether their taxes left them enough to live. The glow of Fei River did not fill empty stomachs. The aristocratic families, flush with prestige after the victory, dug in deeper. They expanded estates, tightened control over provincial posts, and used their influence to dominate court politics. The emperor, far from emerging stronger, found himself overshadowed by the very clans whose armies had saved the dynasty. This was the cruel paradox. The more Jin relied on its nobles for survival, the weaker the throne became. The hope of unity had been rekindled on the battlefield, but in Jiankang's council chambers, power remained hopelessly fragmented. And so the dynasty entered a familiar rhythm, great victories sparking dreams, followed by hesitation, paralysis, and the slow erosion of authority. To outside observers, Jin looked like a dynasty protected by fate, but to those within, it felt more like a dynasty trapped alive, but unable to move forward, chained by the very forces that kept it breathing. The glow of Fei River faded quickly, and what remained was not a dynasty poised for renewal, but one increasingly dominated by its aristocrats. The great families who had carried the state southward, names like Wang, Xia, and later Huan, used their victories and their resources to anchor themselves deeper into the machinery of power. What had begun as necessity during the dynasty's flight became, by the 4th century's end, a system in which the throne itself was little more than a stage prop for the ambitions of clans. These aristocrats controlled vast estates that stretched across the fertile lower Yangtze. They weren't mere landowners, they were self-contained powers. Tenant farmers tilled their fields, private retainers formed their militias, and networks of clients extended into every county. When the state needed soldiers, it leaned on these clans to provide them. When the state needed tax grain, it often had to negotiate with them. Their dominance was practical, not just symbolic. Without them, the dynasty simply could not function. And they knew it. Their sons filled government posts, their daughters married into other powerful lineages, and their names carried more weight in Jiankang's corridors than the emperor's decrees. The emperor presided, but the clans decided. Sometimes, they worked together harmoniously, presenting the illusion of unity. Other times, they bickered and conspired, dragging the court into factional strife. But in all cases, it was clear that Jin was less an empire ruled by an emperor and more an aristocratic confederation bound together by shared interest in preserving the system. The irony is striking. When the Jin first fled south, its rhetoric was filled with talk of restoring the lost heartland, of reclaiming the north. Yet as decades passed, the aristocrats found comfort in the south. The fertile fields and defensible rivers gave them wealth and security. Why risk all that for uncertain wars of reconquest? For them, The dream of returning north was a useful myth to keep hope alive, but not an agenda they intended to pursue in earnest. This entrenchment had consequences. Ambitious generals from outside the aristocratic core found themselves hemmed in, their victories overshadowed, their authority clipped. Talent was measured not solely by merit, but by family name. The imperial bureaucracy became a preserve of elite lineages, shutting out newcomers and ensuring that power circulated within the same tight circles. For commoners, upward mobility narrowed. For the throne, autonomy withered. Yet the system endured precisely because it worked, at least in the short term. The aristocrats had no desire to destroy the dynasty. On the contrary, the emperor's presence legitimized their dominance. They needed the throne as a sacred symbol, the son of heaven to anchor their own power. So they supported the dynasty, but on their terms. The emperor wore the crown, but the clans held the scepter. This aristocratic order gave the Eastern Jin stability, but it was a stability built on compromise. The state survived, but it could not grow strong. It endured, but it could not expand. And as generation followed generation, the great families tightened their grip, weaving themselves into every layer of government until the line between state and clan blurred. The dynasty was theirs, not the emperor's. In the end, the victory at Fei River had not restored the throne's authority, it had entrenched the aristocrats who fought it. The dynasty's flame still burned, but it flickered inside a lantern held firmly in the hands of the clans. The Eastern Jin's survival depended so heavily on the great clans that the throne itself became a hollow crown. Yet even the clans could not monopolize power forever. Into this fragile balance stepped another force, generals and warlords whose control over armies made them indispensable but also deeply threatening. If the aristocrats ruled the court, these commanders ruled the field, and in an age where survival often hinged on steel and discipline, the field mattered just as much as the palace. The Beifu army, forged under the leadership of Xian and his relatives, had proven its worth at Fei River. But the very success of that force showed a dangerous truth. Armies loyal to generals, not the emperor, could make or break the dynasty. Later leaders like Huanwen demonstrated this vividly. A brilliant commander, Huanwen defended the south against northern threats and even launched campaigns to reclaim lost territories. His victories made him a hero, his defeats a source of frustration, but always, his presence loomed larger than the emperor's. At one point, Huanwen marched his forces toward Jiankang itself, not as an invader, but as a reminder. He wanted the court to see that the fate of the dynasty rested in his hands. He stopped short of usurpation, perhaps restrained by hesitation or lack of complete support, but the message was clear. The generals could no longer be treated as mere instruments of the state. They were power brokers in their own right, able to decide whether the dynasty stood or fell. Other warlords followed similar paths. Some carved out regional strongholds, ruling provinces like personal fiefs, while paying lip service to the emperor. Others played the role of loyal defenders, but everyone understood that their loyalty had limits. The emperor's seal was a symbol, their armies were reality. And when the two clashed, reality always won. This erosion of imperial authority further fractured Jin politics. The emperor's position became even weaker, caught between aristocratic clans who guarded their privileges and generals who demanded recognition for their strength. Sometimes the two forces aligned, stabilizing the court. Other times they collided, plunging the dynasty into paralysis or near civil war. The emperor himself, whether wise or feeble, rarely had the means to arbitrate. He was expected to preside, to perform rituals, and to keep the illusion of divine mandate alive, while the true work of governance was hammered out between clan halls and military camps. For the common people, this shift was palpable. Taxes and conscriptions often depended less on imperial edicts and more on whichever general held sway in their region. Soldiers swore loyalty not to the Son of Heaven, but to the commander who fed them. To a farmer on the Yangtze Plains, the emperor's name was distant. The presence of a local general's troops was immediate. In their eyes, the throne had become a ghost, while the warlords were flesh and blood. The paradox of the Eastern Jin grew sharper with each generation. The dynasty lived, but not because the emperor commanded it. It lived because clans and generals found it useful, because no one dared yet to break the fragile arrangement. But every victory a general won, every estate a clan expanded, chipped away at the throne until it was little more than a relic of ceremony. In the long arc of Chinese history, this pattern would repeat again and again. When emperors weakened, generals and warlords rose. In the Eastern Jin, it was not a single usurpation that defined the age, but the slow overshadowing of the emperor by men whose swords carried more weight than imperial seals. The Eastern Jin court in Jiankang became a stage where ambition, intrigue, and fleeting reform played out in endless cycles. The throne, weakened by dependence on clans and generals, was constantly vulnerable to manipulation. Every emperor who rose to the dragon seat carried the burden of proving he was more than a ceremonial figurehead. Some tried to reassert control, others resigned themselves to being pawns, and a few dared to plot reforms that promised to restore vigor to the dynasty. But each effort was fleeting, swallowed by the entrenched power of aristocrats and the looming presence of military strongmen. One of the most striking figures in this pattern was Huan Wen, the general who had already overshadowed the throne. He advanced northward in campaigns to reclaim lost territory, victories that brought glory but not lasting results. Frustrated, he turned his gaze on Jiankang itself. In 369, he marched his army toward the capital, not in open rebellion, but as a veiled challenge. The emperor and court trembled, wondering if this would be the moment the dynasty ended. But Huan Wen hesitated, unable or unwilling to strike the final blow. His retreat left the dynasty intact, yet the lesson was searing. Generals could make emperors quake, and the line between loyalty and usurpation was perilously thin. After Huan Wen's death, his relatives and protégés continued to wield influence, but the throne occasionally flickered with signs of life. Some emperors tried to push back against the suffocating dominance of clans, seeking new officials from lesser families or tightening the central bureaucracy. For a moment, it seemed possible that the dynasty might claw back authority. These reforms, however, never lasted. Aristocrats were too deeply entrenched, their estates too vast, their networks too interwoven with the machinery of the state. A reform-minded emperor might clear a path for meritocratic governance, only to have his successor swept aside or manipulated into reversing course. The court was a labyrinth of factions. Eunuchs whispered alliances, aristocrats schemed in private halls, and generals weighed their loyalty against their ambitions. Some rulers fell not on the battlefield but through palace coups, forced abdications, or carefully orchestrated assassinations. Each change brought a new wave of hope or fear, but the pattern was always the same. The emperor was replaceable, the dynasty fragile, and real power lay elsewhere. Yet amidst this turbulence, there were glimmers of resilience. Certain emperors managed to assert moral authority, reminding the court of the sanctity of the throne. A handful of ministers, loyal to the idea of the dynasty rather than to any clan, pushed for reforms that stabilized finances or reduced corruption. These moments didn't reverse the broader decline, but they kept the dynasty alive. Without them, the Eastern Jin might have collapsed decades earlier. Still, the larger story remained one of fragility. Intrigue became the air the court breathed. Usurpation was always a possibility lurking behind the silk curtains of the palace. And reforms, however well-intentioned, were like brush fires in a gale, briefly illuminating, quickly extinguished. The Eastern Jin stumbled forward not by strength of governance, but by inertia, surviving because its enemies were divided and because no general or clan quite dared to overturn the system entirely yet. While emperors faltered and clans schemed, something quieter yet profoundly transformative was happening in the Eastern Jin world: the rise of Buddhism. Imported centuries earlier along trade routes from India, it had remained a marginal presence during stronger dynasties. But instability is fertile soil for new beliefs, and in the turbulence of the 4th century, Buddhism offered both solace for the common people and fascination for the elite. For villagers crushed by taxes, famine, or the constant threat of conscription, Buddhist monks preached compassion, rebirth, and salvation. They built temples that doubled as refuges, offering food to the hungry and shelter to the displaced. In an age when the dynasty's promises rang hollow, the teachings of karma and nirvana provided explanations for suffering and a hope that life's miseries were not permanent. Imagine a peasant who had seen his village burned by rival princes, sitting before a monk who told him that suffering could be transcended, that there was a path beyond endless cycles of war. It must have felt like water in a desert. For the elite, Buddhism was just as enticing, though for different reasons. Aristocrats and scholars, weary of the emptiness of court politics, turned to Buddhist texts for intellectual and spiritual nourishment. They sponsored monasteries, debated doctrines, and corresponded with monks who had traveled as far as India or Central Asia. Figures like Hui Yuan, who established the famous White Lotus Society at Mount Lu, became respected voices not just in religion, but in philosophy and ethics. Buddhism gave the gentry a way to step outside the suffocating confines of factional politics while still exercising influence over society. Temples rose across the south, their bells and incense drifting into the daily life of towns and villages. Monks translated sutras into Chinese, often with the help of learned aristocrats. The imagery of Buddhist cosmology, vast heavens, fearsome hells, compassionate bodhisattvas, captured imaginations in ways Confucian orthodoxy never had. It wasn't just doctrine, it was art, sculpture, and ritual. The quiet halls of monasteries stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the court. Of course, this new faith was not without tension. Confucian officials worried that Buddhism undermined traditional hierarchies, with its monks renouncing family obligations and its emphasis on spiritual equality. Taoists, long dominant in religious life, saw in Buddhism a rival for influence. Yet these very tensions spurred debate and exchange. Some Buddhist monks adopted Taoist terms to explain their teachings, while Taoist thinkers borrowed imagery from Buddhist cosmology. The result was a dynamic, creative religious landscape that reshaped Chinese culture. The Eastern Jin court itself couldn't ignore Buddhism. While emperors leaned on Confucian ritual to legitimize their rule, they also turned to Buddhist monks for blessings, prayers, and symbolic support. In times of plague or drought, monks were summoned to perform ceremonies. In times of personal doubt, emperors and nobles alike sought comfort in Buddhist doctrine. The dynasty's fragility made spiritual reassurance essential. In a strange way, Buddhism flourished precisely because the dynasty was weak. Had the empire been strong and stable, Confucian orthodoxy might have stifled it. But amid chaos, people looked for new meanings, new structures, and new hope. And Buddhism answered that call. By the time the Eastern Jin staggered into its final century, the faith was no longer a foreign curiosity. It had become an integral part of Chinese life, destined to shape the empire long after the Jin were gone. ChatGPT said, "It may seem paradoxical, but while the Eastern Jin staggered under political fragility, its cultural life blossomed with brilliance. In Jiankang and in the villas of aristocrats scattered along the Yangtze, poetry, calligraphy, painting, and philosophy thrived. Perhaps it was precisely because the court was unstable and war never far from memory that the elite turned so passionately toward the arts. If politics could not provide permanence, then culture might. One of the most enduring legacies of this era was calligraphy. Wang Shiji, often hailed as the sage of calligraphy, lived during this period. His flowing, graceful style became the standard for centuries, admired not only for technical perfection, but for the personality it seemed to breathe into every stroke. Imagine an age when imperial decrees meant little, but a line of ink brushed on silk could command reverence across generations. His preface to the Orchid Pavilion, composed during a gathering of poets in 353, captured the fleeting joy of life against the backdrop of impermanence. A sentiment that resonated deeply in a world where dynasties fell and fortunes shifted overnight. Poetry, too, flourished. The so-called Seven Sages of the Bamboo Grove, though earlier figures, inspired a tradition of aristocrats retreating from court life into nature, seeking freedom in wine, friendship, and verse. Their spirit lived on in Eastern Jin circles, where scholars gathered in gardens and pavilions to escape the suffocating intrigues of Jiankang. Their poems spoke of rivers and mountains, of friendship and mortality, of laughter in the face of uncertainty. To live through an unstable dynasty was to feel the brevity of life keenly, and poetry became both an outlet and a shield. Painting and philosophy also found fertile ground. Artists captured landscapes with new depth, reflecting not just scenery, but the emotional resonance of exile and longing. Taoist ideas intermingled with Buddhist ones, creating art that depicted lofty immortals alongside bodhisattvas, misty mountains alongside flowing rivers, images of transcendence in an era of earthly disappointment. For aristocrats who could not control politics, there was solace in brush and ink, in contemplating eternity on paper when the present felt unbearable. Even the aristocratic lifestyle itself became a kind of cultural performance. Estates in the South turned into centers of refinement, where banquets were punctuated by recitations, where music echoed across lotus ponds, where scholars debated the Tao late into the night. For all their political greed, the clans cultivated beauty with a seriousness that left a lasting legacy. Later dynasties would look back to Eastern Jin gatherings as the model of elegance, the very definition of cultured living. This flourishing was not for everyone. The common people, mired in taxation, famine, or military conscription, rarely tasted the pleasures of refined art. Yet the cultural brilliance of the elite trickled into society over time. Buddhist temples commissioned paintings, poetry spread in popular form, and calligraphy influenced everyday writing. Even as the dynasty's political grip loosened, its cultural achievements sank deep roots into Chinese civilization. In the end, the irony is stark. The Eastern Jin was a dynasty remembered less for political strength than for its art, its thought, and its style. While emperors bowed to clans and generals plotted their rise, ink flowed, poems were sung, and a fragile world produced works that would outlast the dynasty itself. If its throne was weak, its culture was immortal. Beneath the surface of aristocratic villas and poetic gatherings lay a harsher truth. The lives of ordinary people in the Eastern Jin were marked by hardship, displacement, and endless migration. For every cultivated estate along the Yangtze where nobles recited poetry, there were thousands of peasant families trudging south with bundles on their backs, fleeing wars in the north or conscription in the south. The dynasty's survival depended on these masses, yet their stories are often muted in the chronicles, overshadowed by the intrigues of emperors and clans. The fall of Luoyang and Chang'an had triggered waves of refugees decades earlier, and those migrations never truly stopped. Every time northern kingdoms clashed, another stream of people poured across the Yangtze. Fields that had once been tilled for generations were abandoned. Temples and villages crumbled into ruins. Families who had lived on the same land for centuries suddenly found themselves strangers in southern provinces, their northern accents marking them as outsiders. The South, once sparsely populated, became crowded with displaced communities trying to start over. Life for these migrants was grueling. Local elites often seized the best farmland, leaving newcomers to work marginal lands or enter into tenancy under powerful families. Some refugees became bonded laborers on aristocratic estates, exchanging freedom for the promise of protection. Others joined militias, their labor turned into military service. The empire needed them, new hands to cultivate rice, new bodies to fill armies, but gave them little in return. Even those who had lived in the south before Jin's retreat found their lives upended. Suddenly, their villages were swelling with northern strangers, their taxes rising as the court struggled to fund armies and rituals. Competition for resources fueled tension. The aristocrats, with their vast estates, were shielded, but commoners, whether native or refugee, bore the brunt of the state's weakness. Famine was a recurring companion. Floods along the Yangtze or poor harvests in crowded southern provinces often meant starvation. The government, dominated by clans more interested in preserving their privileges, offered little relief. Temples sometimes filled the gap, distributing food or shelter, but they could not meet the scale of need. Rebellions simmered periodically, peasant uprisings sparked by desperation, but they were crushed swiftly. their participants branded as bandits. To the court, they were nuisances. To the people, they were cries of despair. And yet, amid this suffering, resilience persisted. Refugee communities carried their traditions, their dialects, their customs into the South, blending them with local ways. Over generations, these cultural exchanges transformed southern China from a periphery into a heartland of its own. Farmers learned new techniques suited to rice paddies, artisans adapted crafts, storytellers blended northern and southern folklore. The migration was painful, but it reshaped China's demographic map in ways that would last long beyond the Jin. Still, it's important to remember that the dynasty's cultural brilliance rested on this foundation of hardship. The calligraphy of Wang Shiji, the poetry of aristocrats, the elegance of Jiankang's villas, all were sustained by peasants who labored, paid taxes, and endured dislocation. For every gathering at an orchid pavilion, there were countless families who had lost their ancestral graves, their villages, their homes. The dynasty may have survived in exile, but its survival was written in the weary footsteps of those who kept moving south, generation after generation. The Yangtze River became both shield and shackle for the Eastern Jin. On one hand, it was a natural barrier that saved the dynasty from the fate of Luoyang and Chang'an. Time and again, northern armies faltered at its banks, their cavalry frustrated by its width and current. The river gave Jianqing the breathing room it needed to exist at all. Yet what protected also confined. The dynasty could not push far beyond it, no matter how loudly officials proclaimed the dream of reconquest. Every emperor, every general, every aristocratic clan in Jiankang spoke of restoring the lost north. Rituals invoked the spirits of ancient capitals. Proclamations promised the people a return to their ancestral lands. But when the moment came to act, hesitation ruled. Campaigns across the river required immense resources, grain for supply lines, ships to ferry troops, and above all, a disciplined army. The dynasty had none of these in abundance. Aristocratic families hoarded wealth and manpower, reluctant to risk their estates for campaigns that might weaken their hold at home. Generals, even ambitious ones, lacked the support for long-term offensives. Occasional attempts were made. Huan Wen, the formidable general, launched expeditions northward in the mid-4th century. He advanced deep into enemy territory, even capturing Luoyang for a brief, exhilarating moment. But his armies were stretched thin, supply lines broke down, and local support was scarce. The northern landscape, ravaged by decades of war, could not sustain him. Within months, he was forced to retreat, his dreams of restoring the heartland slipping away like sand through fingers. The failure did not just dampen hopes, it reinforced the idea that the dynasty's survival depended on holding the South, not risking it for glory. This defensive posture hardened into habit. The Yangtze, once envisioned as a launching point, became the dynasty's horizon. Forts lined its banks, garrisons drilled along its waters, and watchtowers sent signals at the first sign of enemy movement. The dynasty became expert at defending, but incapable of expanding. Generals trained for river battles, not for the grueling campaigns needed to conquer the plains of the north. For the people, this meant the rhetoric of restoring the north became hollow. Refugees who had fled south held onto memories of ancestral graves and lost lands, but as decades passed, entire generations grew up knowing only the South. Their loyalties shifted from the dream of return to the reality of survival. Jiankang became home, the Yangtze their frontier. The dynasty's map still painted all under heaven in its colors, but the lived reality was smaller, bounded, and defensive. The result was a strange duality. In ritual and proclamation, the Eastern Jin claimed to rule all of China. In practice, it was a regional dynasty confined behind a river. Its culture thrived, its politics sputtered, its armies held firm, but the gap between claim and reality widened with each passing year. The Yangtze had preserved the dynasty, but also imprisoned it. And while Jin clung to its southern bastion, the north was not standing still. There, new powers were rising, consolidating the chaos of the 16 kingdoms into more formidable states. The longer Jin remained trapped behind the river, the stronger its rivals became. Sooner or later, the balance would tip. ChatGPT said, as the eastern Jin clung to its southern bastion, the landscape north of the Yangtze began to change. The chaos of the 16 kingdoms, once a swirl of petty rulers rising and falling, gradually gave way to consolidation. Out of the ashes of endless civil wars and shifting banners, stronger northern dynasties began to emerge, states with enough discipline, resources, and vision to endure. For Jin, this was ominous. The farther time stretched, the more the dream of reconquest slipped away, replaced by the reality of formidable rivals across the river. One of the first to loom large was the former Qin under Fujian, whose defeat at Fei River had spared the south but left a lasting reminder. The north was capable of producing empires strong enough to threaten Jin's very survival. Though Fujian's dynasty fractured after his downfall, his ambition set a precedent. The north would not remain a patchwork forever. Sooner or later, another ruler would consolidate it again. By the early 5th century, that role was being filled by the Northern Wei, founded by the Xianbei people. Unlike earlier regimes that had flared briefly before collapsing, the Northern Wei displayed a striking adaptability. Its rulers embraced Chinese titles, Confucian rituals, and systems of governance, even as they retained the martial vigor of the steppe. They reformed land policies, strengthened administration, and built capitals that rivaled those of the Great Han and Tang. For the Eastern Jin, which remained shackled by aristocratic dominance and regionalism, this was a chilling contrast. The North was not only surviving, it was building. The consolidation of the North also shifted the balance of cultural legitimacy. For decades, Jin had relied on its claim to be the sole legitimate heir of Chinese civilization. But as northern dynasties stabilized, they too adopted the trappings of Chinese imperial authority. Their emperors performed sacrifices to heaven, patronized Confucian scholars, and built monumental projects to signal permanence. To peasants in the north, who had never seen Jiankang or the Yangtze, these rulers looked every bit as legitimate as the exiled Sima emperors. The ideological monopoly of Jin was crumbling. Trade and migration further blurred the lines. Merchants moved between north and south, carrying not only goods, but stories of order under northern rulers. Refugees who once fled south sometimes chose to remain in the north, accepting the rule of dynasties that offered stability in exchange for loyalty. The South's claim to be the sole refuge of civilization no longer rang as true when rival capitals in the north gleamed with new palaces and bustling markets. For Jin, this consolidation was a death knell in slow motion. The dynasty had survived as long as the north was divided, its rivals too fractured to mount lasting campaigns. But the rise of powers like Northern Wei meant that the clock was ticking. The longer Jin lingered behind the Yangtze, the more it ceded not only territory but legitimacy. And while its poets, calligraphers, and aristocrats cultivated elegance, the north was preparing to eclipse it. The South could not ignore this forever. But when a dynasty grows accustomed to survival rather than ambition, change often comes too late. The stage was set for the final unraveling, less by a single great invasion than by the slow strangulation of a dynasty trapped in its own contradictions, overshadowed by rising northern empires. By the early 5th century, the Eastern Jin was no longer held together by hope of reconquest, but by inertia and compromise. The dynasty had survived warlords, invasions, and humiliation, yet its greatest enemy was still itself. Internal strife, festering for decades beneath the surface, finally broke through in waves of rebellion, coups, and bitter factional feuds that hollowed the state from within. The throne, already weakened by aristocratic dominance, became a prize in endless struggles. Emperors rose and fell not through grand battles with northern dynasties, but through palace conspiracies and clan machinations. One of the most notorious episodes came in 402, when the general Huan Xian seized power, forcing the emperor to abdicate and briefly declaring his own dynasty. His rule collapsed within a year, but the damage was lasting. He had proved how fragile the imperial institution had become, how easily it could be toppled when generals lost patience with a weak court. Other strongmen followed. The Liu clan, rising from modest roots, steadily built power through military command and shrewd political maneuvering. Liu Yu, in particular, emerged as the figure who defined Jin's final decades. A talented general, he crushed rebellions, defended the dynasty from external threats, and gained enormous prestige. His campaigns into the north recaptured some lost territories, stirring brief excitement that perhaps the mandate might be restored. But everyone could see the truth. Liu was not fighting for Jin's restoration, but for his own future. The emperor, meanwhile, was a shadow. Rituals continued, sacrifices performed, edicts issued, but all in the name of a throne that no longer commanded real obedience. Ministers debated policies in Jiankang, yet it was generals in the field who determined outcomes. The court became paralyzed by fear. If they resisted strongmen like Liu Yu, they risked annihilation. If they cooperated, they hastened the erosion of imperial authority. Either way, the emperor was little more than a hostage of circumstance. For the people, these power struggles meant more upheaval. Armies marched not against foreign invaders, but against rival factions within the dynasty. Taxes rose to fund campaigns that decided nothing for the common good. Refugees who had once crossed the Yangtze found themselves displaced again, fleeing wars not from the north, but from the dynasty's own guardians turned predators. Famine and plague followed in the wake of rebellion, reminders that every civil conflict bled the land dry. By the 410s, it was clear to all that Jin could not endure in its current form. The dynasty had survived invasion and exile, but it could not survive the suffocating grip of its own generals and clans. Power had fragmented beyond repair. The aristocrats had grown complacent, protecting their estates rather than the empire. The emperors had grown powerless, unable to rule in more than name. And the generals, ambitious, restless, commanding the loyalty of men and provinces, had grown too strong to be contained. The Eastern Jin did not collapse in a single spectacular implosion, but unraveled in slow motion, undone by the very people entrusted with its survival. And at the center of this unraveling stood Liu Yu, a man who would extinguish the dynasty not with rebellion from outside, but with ambition from within. Liu Yu's rise was the final act in the long drama of Jin decline. Born far from the aristocratic lineages that had dominated Jiankang's politics, he was not a man of noble blood, but of sheer talent and ambition. His early years were marked by hardship. Stories tell of him laboring as a woodcutter, a man who knew the sting of poverty. Yet in a world where the dynasty had grown complacent and corrupt, Liu Yu's strength, discipline, and charisma set him apart. He was the kind of figure dynasties in crisis often produce, an outsider whose merit carried him higher than pedigree ever could. Through military command, he carved out his reputation. Liu Yu led armies with relentless energy, defending the south against northern incursions and putting down rebellions that threatened Jin's fragile hold on power. Unlike many generals before him, he was ruthlessly efficient. Where aristocratic leaders hesitated, Liu Yu struck. Where others enriched themselves, he restored order. Soldiers adored him. Ministers feared him. Each campaign tightened his grip, until it was obvious that the empire's survival rested not with the emperor, but with Liu Yu's sword. In 416, he launched one of the most ambitious northern campaigns the Eastern Jin had ever attempted. His armies surged across the Yellow River, recapturing Luoyang, the old capital, the city of memories, the place where Jin's humiliation had begun over a century earlier. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the dynasty's lost glory might be restored. Refugees and poets alike wept at the thought of returning home. Yet, even as he raised the Jin banner over Luoyang, it was clear whose victory it really was. The emperor remained in Jiankang, powerless, while Liu stood in the field, master of the moment. That campaign revealed the truth. Liu was no longer just a general serving Jin. He was a ruler in waiting. He began consolidating titles, rewarding loyalists, and building the framework of his own dynasty. Aristocrats who had once sneered at his humble origins now courted his favor, recognizing that the tide had shifted. The emperor, reduced to ceremony, could only watch as authority drained away. By 420, the facade could no longer be maintained. Liu forced the last Jin ruler, Emperor Gong, to abdicate. With ritual words and the passing of imperial seals, the dynasty that had once unified China, then staggered into exile, came to an end. In its place rose the Lusong dynasty, founded by the man who had clawed his way from obscurity to ultimate power. To some, it was betrayal, Jin extinguished by the very general it had relied upon. To others, it was necessity, the removal of a hollow house, replaced by one with real strength. Either way, the dynasty was finished. The eclipse of Jin authority was not a thunderclap but a slow sunset. From Sima Yan's triumph in unification to Emperor Gong's quiet abdication, the dynasty had been defined by contradictions: unity won, then squandered, peace achieved, then corrupted, survival secured, but never control. Liyu's takeover was simply the final punctuation mark on a story already written. The curtain fell on the Jin in 420 with the abdication of Emperor Gong, but the dynasty's story didn't simply vanish. Its legacy lingered, woven deep into China's historical memory, a strange mixture of triumph, humiliation, survival, and cultural brilliance. If history often paints dynasties in bold strokes, Jin's portrait is painted in contradictions. On one side, it was the dynasty that had finally unified the realm after the long chaos of the Three Kingdoms. For that alone, its founders earned a place of honor. Sima Yan's reunification in 280 gave the empire a fleeting moment of peace, a chance to imagine that the mandate of heaven had returned to order. Yet that unity dissolved almost as quickly as it was achieved. The War of the Eight Princes and the invasions from the north exposed how shallow the dynasty's foundations truly were. Jin became not a symbol of strength, but of squandered opportunity. And yet, in its collapse, Jin displayed a remarkable resilience. Most dynasties that lose their capitals, their emperors, and their heartlands vanish entirely. Jin did not. It retreated across the Yangtze, transformed itself in exile, and endured for another century. The Eastern Jin proved that survival could be just as defining as victory. It carried forward the ritual authority of the throne, preserved culture in the south, and created the framework for later southern dynasties. Without Jin's endurance, China's political map might have fractured permanently. Culturally, its legacy was immense. The calligraphy of Wang Shiji, the poetry of gatherings at orchid pavilions, the spread of Buddhism, and the refinement of aristocratic life all flourished under Jin's shadow. While the court stumbled through intrigues and generals played at power, scholars, monks, and artists left works that shaped Chinese civilization for centuries. In this way, the dynasty's weakness in politics coincided with brilliance in art and thought, a paradox repeated in other troubled ages. For the common people, however, Jin's legacy was harsher. Their lives were marked by migrations, famine, conscription, and the heavy hand of aristocratic estates. The dynasty's survival was bought with their suffering and their resilience. Carrying culture, labor, and memory southward was the unspoken foundation of Jin endurance. History remembers emperors and generals, but the true weight was carried on the backs of those who trudged across rivers and tilled new lands. Perhaps the greatest lesson of Jin lies in its contradictions. It unified China, yet could not hold it. It lost the north, yet endured in the south. It presided over political failure, yet midwifed cultural brilliance. And it ended not with a climactic fall from outside invasion, but with quiet replacement from within, as one of its own generals took the throne. In the sweep of Chinese history, the Jin dynasty was neither the most glorious nor the most powerful, but it was pivotal. It marked the end of the classical age of Han heirs and the beginning of a new world where China would be divided between northern conquerors and southern courts. Its story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of aristocratic dominance, the fragility of unity, and the need for balance between throne, clan, and army. When Liu took the mandate in 420, Jin's banner came down, but the river still flowed, The monastery still chanted, the calligraphy still breathed life on silk. The dynasty had passed, but its contradictions, its rise and fall, its brilliance and weakness, remained etched in memory. In that sense, the Jin left behind not just a cautionary tale, but a reminder: dynasties are mortal, but the culture they nurture can outlast their crowns.